This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Who liked that? Yes, so Thursday is going to be your exam revision lecture, and it's not recorded. So if you want to know what's in there, either come or send, get notes off someone else, one of your friends. Okay then, let's get started. So we have a lot to get through today, and I think I got rolling on this at the last lecture, but right, so we're in the post-market surveillance stage. So once a device has made it onto the market, you would, after all that exhaustive process that we went through, you would think it was safe, right? Wrong. So what is design failure? Efficacy versus effectiveness, which is where a lot of the problems come in. Then we have some case studies of failures, like epic failures. And then we have medical device registries. I actually had too many case studies, and I couldn't cover them all, so I just picked a couple. But I was really sad not to be able to cover more of them. So we talked about this at the last lecture, for those of you who weren't here. We were talking about surgical mesh, so for pelvic floor surgery, and whether it's a medical device, and it is. And we know that reporting is often skewed towards newer devices because they're more exciting, and it's really easy for an established device to sort of slip through the gaps. And we know that reporting isn't mandatory everywhere. So for reporting to truly work, you need like a national database, or you need a national regulator such as the TGA to keep track of it. And again, there's a distinction between failure, side effect, poor surgical outcome, or poor surgical method. So knowing the difference and knowing what to report is key. And as I say to everyone, if you're in doubt, just report it. The TGA will sort out whether it's a notifiable action item or not. So, all right, so we were talking about some reporters getting adventurous and actually almost managing to get fruit netting approved as a medical device. And we were talking about the surgical mesh issue in Australia and how it ended up hurting thousands of patients. So again, there's a lot of issues. Even in a high regulatory environment such as Australia, we found that when we went back to try and find these women that had these procedures done, we couldn't identify them all. And not only that, but a lot of the women that we did identify had no clue that there was surgical mesh actually left behind. They just got told they're having a surgery. So again, patient consent and information was an issue. And when the Senate Community Affairs References Committee released their report last year, their main recommendation was set up a national register to track all implants. So that was the biggest sort of fail-safe that you can have. So there's power in data. By having the data and having information, you can then use that to your advantage. And it's actually a huge cost-saving mechanism, and I'll have some data on that later. So, okay. So just like from a really basic design process control and design perspective, what is design failure? So before we get to device failure, we need to look at design failure. And what is the defect? We need to establish a link between harm and a causal link, so what causes it? Can we correct it? Is it really easy to fix? You know how we were talking about maybe just change the information for use or update the labeling if you can, or maybe just repackage the device. And then how does it compare to similar products? So this is just a crude example to illustrate how design defect works, but it's an urban legend that every Friday at this hospital, at least one patient would die in the ICU. So like clockwork, every Friday a patient would die, and they figured out that when the cleaner would come in during the night shift to do the vacuuming, she'd unplug one of the machines, plug in the vacuum cleaner, do the vacuuming, and then plug the machine back in and go off on her way, not having realized that the patient had actually passed away. So, you know what? I actually believe this probably happened. If not there, then somewhere else. Maybe not recently, but it would have happened at some point. So what's the defect? Life support equipment could be unknowingly unplugged without an alarm going off. Casual link, staff were not alerted, and then alternative designs was actually adding an alarm or make it really hard to unplug, or all of the above. And having battery backup. So this is just one example. And when we look at design failure, there are lots of differing definitions, and I don't care which definition you use, you just need to understand what design failure is, and that there's lots of different aspects of design failure. Sometimes you need the court to make that distinction. You need testimony from experts, and you get a bunch of, I'm telling you, having attended the TGA specialist committee, you get a bunch of experts in one room, they almost never agree on anything. So it's difficult, it can be difficult to separate liability from design flaw. All right, and we leave that for the lawyers. I'm not going to talk about that. And negligence is a legal, not a technical term, right? All right, so just an example was medical devices and fire. So you can have lots of medical devices that are used while you're using an oxygen tank for patients. Also, people smoke, so especially old people tend to smoke a bit more than younger people. So I'm just saying you can see where this is going, right? So that's just one example that I'm not going to talk about, but we know that stuff fails because of lots of factors, human error being the biggest one. Bad luck, random effects, which can go either way, and then there's bias. Then there's people not using stuff properly, not being trained properly. There's bias in saying, well, this patient's going to die anyway. Am I going to give it my best during the surgery? Maybe I'll just, if you have 10 other patients waiting, actually, I probably shouldn't say that. It doesn't happen, but if you believe that your patient has a high probability of death, and you have 3 other patients, and you know that you're more likely to save patient X than patient Y, you would probably spend longer on the surgery for patient X than patient Y. So sometimes you're just going through the motions because you have to. Right. That's not examinable, by the way, don't quote me on that. So why do devices in the real world really fail? So the most important thing, so this is the slide that we want to think about, is lack of testing. We were talking about in a previous lecture about why it's so hard to do proper clinical trials for medical devices, why it's hard to get that reliable data. We were talking about the ethics of testing medical devices. So sometimes it's impossible to test. Other times you've tested it, but you've only got very, very limited evidence, but you know you're not going to get any more, or you're really rushing and pushing to try and get it to market because someone else is making exactly the same device. We know that devices have a much shorter time frame, lifetime, than pharmaceuticals. We know that whatever you put on the market will probably be replaced by the next model within 18 months to 24 months, 2 years. So that's not a lot of money to get your investment back and to establish yourself as a manufacturer, because we were talking about all the costs associated with it. Then there's the issue of appropriate use. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Then there's recipes for disaster. We were talking about the eye issue. If you remember the injectable that they mixed, so they used filler along with some of the stem cells, and it caused that to form bones instead of collagen, right, in someone's eye. And then we have unforeseen factors such as efficacy versus effectiveness. You have something performing a certain way in a very controlled environment over a certain short period of time, and then you throw it in the real world and stuff just starts to go wrong. So you need a mechanism to catch that. All right, so US data is a lot easier to come by than Australian data. But we know that over the last 10 years, there's been approximately more than, and this is like where they can prove the causation. There's a lot more where they can't prove it, or the device is not, the data is not recorded in a way that can be included in the database. So over the last 10 years, they found more than 1.7 million injuries linked to medical devices, and out of those, 83,000 were deaths. Now, I wonder what happened in 2014. There was a few issues around then, but it doesn't look very good, does it? So what is the current environment for Australia? The biggest consumer of medical devices is people 65 or older. And we know that this population, because of the shift in, oh my God, I've lost the plot. Anyways, the average Australian population is getting older. So because of the demographic shift, we know that we're going to end up with way more people using medical devices than do right now. And that's because they're actually useful. They solve a problem. We have pacemakers that literally save people's lives. We have orthopedic implants which can enable people to walk. We have lots of really wonderful stuff as an outcome. All right, so if we look at, that's Australia. If we look at the European Union, it's slightly different. So what happened? No. Okay. Never mind. So in one of our workshops, we were talking about how the regulatory environment changes from country to country. And the reason I'm focused on this is because you end up with so the European Union, we have mutual recognition agreements with the European Union. If something gets certified as safe in Australia, they can automatically sell it there, provided they get a MRA certificate. If something is certified in Europe, sometimes they can sell it here with just an MRA certificate, with the same certificate, unless it's a class 3, in which case we do some partial assessment. So it's not a big assessment like we would for a new device. So I say this because there's been lots of issues with that system, and there's been lots of issues with the European system of regulation. So instead of having one big central agency like we do, they have lots of little companies known as notified bodies that you can hire to certify your device, and they get paid for that. Right? So they're not super independent, and there's a lot of competition between them. And so there's a bit more of a push on them to actually get business and to get these devices through. Yes, and they're exempt from laws that require them to make the records of failures public. Whereas in Australia, they're actually published. All device failures are published. All recalls and all that stuff gets published. So that's a bit of an issue. So when it comes to medical devices, the main issues are that it used to be an unregulated space, and now it's only partially regulated compared to something like pharmaceuticals. It's easier to get medical devices on the market with less evidence. And just because devices have been known to be harmful and pulled off the shelf in one country doesn't mean that they don't remain available for sale and use in other countries, despite the evidence of harm. Kind of crazy, but if that country doesn't regulate it, they're going to keep selling them there, and they're going to keep using them. So even those surgical meshes that we were talking about, that is essentially putting a cheese grater in your pelvis, they're still using them in several countries. So scary stuff. Okay, so regulators struggle to quickly identify hazardous implants after they're released. So we were saying about how many you can actually see. All right. So this is one of the examples, which I just thought I'd move away from the pelvic floor stuff because you can't really use a lot of images. So we have the nanostim example. We looked at cardiac implants, and they use little wires called leads. So the issue with those is that that's often where the device failure happens. Those wires can get loose, they can migrate in the heart, they can disconnect. And you have this big device that sits just on top of your sternum that you can feel, and patients don't particularly love it, right? So it's a very competitive market, and someone has been trying to come up with a different version of a pacemaker. They've been trying to reinvent it for quite some time now. St. Jude Medical, which later got acquired by Abbott Inc., if anyone cares about that sort of stuff, they pulled out an implant which was the size of a battery and the shape of a battery, and they said, this is our lead-free pacemaker, and it goes directly into the heart instead of sitting out here, and it's going to revolutionize how we do this. And it was like a huge thing, and this lady here was one of their first patients, Maureen. And she was a 77-year-old grandmother from London, and instead of having like a 3-day surgery to have a pacemaker put in, Apparently putting it in took the surgeon only about 8 minutes. So they didn't do open heart surgery, they went through the venous circulation and they just popped it in, and I'll show you an image. All right. And it was 10 times the size of a regular implant. So there's the lead. It deposits it into the heart, and it then, can you see it? It's super tiny. So then it works as a pacemaker from within the heart, as opposed to sitting on the surface and using leads. All right, so as you can tell, it probably didn't go very well. So 3 months after that lady's operation, who was the first patient, they started to have issues. So within 3 months, they put it in 200 patients, and they found that 147 patients of those, so that's 75%, had issues. One of the most common issues was suffering a perforated heart muscle. So when you're injecting something into the heart and you want it to permanently stay there, and it's like a contracting muscle that is often in elderly people and often has issues. So you can have either thickening of the heart or thinning of the muscle wall or whatever. So it didn't go very well. And then they found that the battery would actually drain a hell of a lot quicker than what the engineers said it would. So one of the main advantages was they said that the battery would last up to 19 years. So as the traditional pacemakers, you have to go and have the battery replaced every like 5 to 10 years or something. Whereas they said this was like a one and done, but they found that the battery actually failed after a couple of years. And it failed catastrophically, as in it completely discharged. Okay, so this was like within 3 months, and you're like, they really should have done this testing prior to implantation, right? So by 2016, they sort of said, let's stop this for a minute, and then it never restarted. So this lady that they used as she gave media interviews, said how wonderful it was. She was able to go home immediately, like after the day procedure. She ended up having her implant fail 2 years later, and she ended up having to have like massive surgery, and she had complications because she was on blood thinners because she had the metal implant in. So they ended up putting in a traditional pacemaker, but they couldn't actually extract the previous one. So it's still in there, and she nearly died at the operating table, bled profusely. Long story short, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be. And when they did the device, they told her it was the best new thing and that it was going to last her until she died, right? So she actually then came out and said, they never told me of any of these risks. So did she actually give informed consent or not? Right. So with traditional pacemakers, they're easy to replace when the battery dies. These things, even though they're supposed to be designed to be able to be pulled out easily, they weren't. So lots of stuff went wrong. And the reason for that is that they just rushed it to market. They want it to be first. And it was certified as safe with only minimal testing. So the European Union says we need at least one clinical trial and hundreds of thousands of patients. This particular device was only tested on 33 human patients, and I think 2 of those died. And it was only tested for 90 days. So something that you're expected to have in your body for 10 years, they only tested it for 90 days. The only other trial that they did was on sheep, and we all know how reflective that is of human trials. All right, so then there was the question is, was it sufficiently tested? There was a class action, but because of the paperwork you sign when you have experimental treatments, it's very hard to sue. And this lady said, look, I wasn't told any of this. I was just told it's great, it's fantastic, and it's going to last me until I die. That's what she told the media. All right, so we know that stuff is going wrong in the European Union, but it's not the only place. So, for example, I just took this as an example because it was mentioned in the media a couple of times. In Chile, it's completely voluntary whether you report implanted device failure. And when they were asked by the media, the regulator said that in the last 10 years, they've only had 2 notifications in 10 years for medical devices. So if you compare that to something like the US, which has just under 100,000 notifications a year, even though it's a much smaller country, you'd still expect to see more than 2. So something's clearly not being recorded there. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this one because it is probably the most known, relevant. Who's heard of the PIP implants? It was, yeah, you guys have heard it. You've probably studied it. It was all over the media. There was like this big storm. And so basically, they were very popular breast implants. So initially, breast implants were filled with saline solution. However, they had issues of it would pop, and then you'd wake up the next day and have no boob. So it would be completely flat. So patients didn't like that. They also felt like squeezing a bag filled with saline solution, right? So they wanted something that was like a bit more consistent, that wouldn't immediately drain. They just wanted a new material. So they came up with the silicone-filled bag. Oh, and the other thing that the the saline solution bags tended to do was they tended to grow mold inside them. Doesn't matter how much you sterilize it, because they can have micro fractures and other stuff, and you have like a heated body of external water within yourself, which is sequestered. That's never a good idea, right? So yeah, they would grow mold and then they would leak because the mold would actually affect the lining of the implant. Long story short, they went, let's go with medical grade silicone. It feels so much better. Even if you have a tiny little fracture, it's not going to leak. It's going to stay where it is. Feels so much nicer, better results. So they went with that, and they were hugely popular. And one of the first companies to do it was called Polyimplant Prosthèses. I can't pronounce it. It's a French company. So that's the name of the company. And they turned out to be, they made a lot of money, but they turned out to be quite dodgy. So eventually they were recalled by the French authority because they found that there was an increase in the incidence of ruptures and concerns that they contained unapproved ingredients. So just to give you some idea of what a rupture actually looks like. So with silicone implants, it can be small or it can be large. It can be varied. It went from like a catastrophic rupture where everything just went, you can see one here. So that's compared with the second one that was extracted, right? Where it just completely disintegrated. Then you had ones where you needed to actually, you couldn't tell that they were leaking, but they were leaking. So unless you had like a large body of silicone outside of the implant, you wouldn't be able to see it on an MRI or a CT scan. Then there was the issue of encapsulation, which to be fair actually happens to most breast implants over time. And then you can have capsular retraction, which means that like it pulls on it and it squeezes the breast implant, which can also cause it to pop. But these breast implants got a lot more encapsulation a lot quicker than the traditional ones. So sometimes the gel would leak inside the capsule and sometimes it would leak outside the capsule. So women started complaining about, so when surgeons would open these up, they'd be like white goo just leaking out. Women would have blocked, oh my God, like lymph nodes. They would complain of fatigue, of muscle pain, of lots of very non-specific factors, but there was a lot of inflammation. So all that white gunky stuff that you might, I think I have another image of it, was actually their body reacting to the silicone. So normally if you're using hospital grade silicone, that doesn't happen as badly, right? So they're saying, what the hell is going on? Oh, and there's lumps and discomfort and stuff, like the silicone can actually migrate to other parts of your body. It can leak into your abdomen. It just depends on how the surgery was done. So it's really unpleasant. Big issue was that these manufacturers were super dodgy. So they used to sign off the paperwork that they used hospital grade silicone, but they actually used industrial grade silicone, which is actually processed differently. It's a different purity. It might not be as sterile. So even though they sterilized it, it had different compounds inside it. So it's like they literally use stuff that you'd use for like seal drain sealant, like for tiles and stuff, to put in these implants. Not only that, but their materials weren't of the best quality. So because you're using industrial grade silicone, it would eat through the sac that was holding it a lot quicker. So on their paperwork, it said that they were using hospital grade silicone, but in reality, during one of the inspections, it was found that they weren't. And this is probably because it was cheaper, probably more available. So whenever, and it was intermittent, so whenever they could get hospital grade silicone, they would use that. Whenever they couldn't, they would use the other one. And it wasn't recorded anywhere as which batch was which. So that's a big problem. So yeah, so we used these in Australia from September for a while, 1999 until April 2010. So yeah, 10 years. And they were recalled. However, then the issue was like, what do we do with the people that got them? Because taking them out is actually a big surgery, and then you have to replace them with something else. And we know that breast implants wear out after about 8 to 10 years, so they're going to have them taken out anyways. So you just wait. So there was about 13,200 put in. Not all of, so that doesn't mean 13,000 patients. Some of them got 2, some of them only got 1, some of them got 1 but didn't use it, but it was recorded as being used. And some of them would have been removed for whatever reason. So, you know, we can round off that number. So not all of them are used for like cosmetic purposes. There's lots of cancer patients and so on. So yeah, I just put this in there because I wanted to highlight that women reported burning, pain, lumps, and allergic and autoimmune reactions from leaking silicone. There was a couple of cases of breast cancer being reported. To be fair, that happens with saline solution as well. You're more likely to have further, like breast cancer that's further developed, because it's really difficult to image breasts when you have implants in. So you won't, if you're doing breast cancer imaging, you won't spot it until much later. Right? So there was, after this happened, there was lots of media panic. There was lack of traceability in most countries and difficulty in detecting a rupture. So it's actually hard to decide whether it's ruptured or not. The symptoms were all over the shop, and they found that some devices just failed catastrophically. Others were totally fine, and we don't know if these are the ones that use the bad silicone and the others were the ones that use the good silicone, and we can't trace it to tell. There was a question regarding irritation and carcinogenicity. There was a lot of self-reporting in the media, and there was an inconsistency when testing the implants that were removed. So as I was showing you that picture before, like some of it, they all look different. They all behave different. They had different characteristics, even though they were exactly the same breast implant. So there was obviously stuff that had gone wrong with the manufacturing process where it was probably inconsistent. So can you make that device the same each and every time? The answer here would have been no. But they got away with it for 10 years. So some blurry pictures. So just to be fair, breast implants are a high-risk medical device anyways. So putting the silicone aside, some of them will rupture within that 10-year gap, and most of them will need to be replaced because of encapsulation and other things. So you can have a rupture without any clinical signs or symptoms. Yes. So I think I mentioned all of that. There is one possible link between all silicone breast implants and a very, very rare type of breast cancer that's not seen with silicone implants. So they had to mention that, but it's super small. So in the end, in Australia, this was in 2014, I imagine there was more since then. Out of those 13,000, they found that about 5% of them had an issue in 2014, so that would have changed now. And the average complication percentage for standard breast implants is about 4%, 3 to 4%. So it was like 1% more that had an issue. But because of the scare and because we can't actually trace some of these devices in Australia, most women that had them done just wanted them out. So they said, oh, do we take them out or not? So they issued an advice that unless it's ruptured, they should leave them in, and then who's going to pay for it? Because most women got these done because cosmetic breast implants are not covered by Medicare. So you have to pay for them privately unless you've had breast cancer, in which case they are. There's a clinical need. So most of the time, these women paid like $20,000, $30,000, $60,000 to get these put in, and now they were saying, well, who's going to pay for them to come out? And Medicare eventually paid for it. So we paid for it, the taxpayer paid for it, and they said, if it's ruptured, take it out, or if there's a lot of anxiety around the implant, so if there was like a mental health issue related to it, then it was justifiable to take it out, but they left the decision up to the surgeon. So they did a lot of evidence, and they found that there was very little, even though there were crappy breast implants and they had a high risk of perforation, there was very little evidence to support that there was like a massive increase in irritability and toxicity and complications. So in the end, they sort of said, just leave them in if you can. If you can't, take them out and replace them with something else. To be fair, one of the newer models of breast implants, they use this like special coating to try and get the tissue to grow into the implant, and they found that the coating was carcinogenic, but that's a different story. All right, so they did a whole heap of testing for these breast implants, and they said, it's all right. The risk of cancer is about equivalent to a standard one because you get inflammation there too. There are some dodgy chemicals that you would get, but as I said, other than that one rare breast cancer, most of the time they're all right. And they were actually saying that those ingredients are stuff that you'd be exposed to in domestic cleaning products anyways, so you'd already have them in your body. Whether you're male or female doing cleaning, I don't know, I'm not going to comment on that. And then the European Commission just recently said that, so this was, sorry, it's a bit text heavy, I just didn't want you looking up the document. All you need to know is that they agreed with the TGA. And they said, look, leave them in. If they're ruptured, then they need to come out. Here we go. So yeah, they were saying that siloxanes are in many domestic products, and they're not worried about it. And there were some cases with inflammatory reactions, either locally or in lymph nodes, but statistically speaking, they weren't linked with symptoms. Even though the incidence was higher, the rate of actual symptoms related to that was lower. So they decided it wasn't an issue. So yeah, you might get lumps, but they wouldn't be sore or whatever. Okay. But people are still stressed out about these. So yes, love yourself the way you are. You don't need a boob job, is the moral of that story. And they look horrible. Defibrillator failure. You know how I was talking about there's defibrillators, so that they've had so many failures because they've had so many devices, but most of the time they work really well, but it was like a hit and miss. I remember there was one which just started randomly because of those leads. It would discharge an electrical impulse, and it started just randomly shocking patients' hearts. They hadn't stopped, it just started shocking them. I know there was one lady, she had 18, so normally after a couple of times it does that, you die, but she had recorded 18 instances where her defibrillator shocked her before she had it taken out. So that's pretty bad. And then this one is this the one with the battery? Oh, we talked about the one where the battery actually stopped working, so it didn't shock you at all. So that's even worse. For arrhythmias, so this one, why did I put this one in there? Oh yeah. This one, they thought, we'll come up with something new. We'll make those lead wires that I was talking about, we'll make them a lot thinner and more flexible, so it's not like as damaging to the heart muscle when we put them in. Sounds really good in theory. They did it. They put them in like 300,000 patients before someone went, those are actually a bit too thin. They tend to fracture and move and don't work as well. This is the one that was shocking patients. So there was at least 5 patient deaths attributed to it, and this actually went up to 20 from when the device was recalled to when they were all replaced. And Medtronic actually acknowledged that, which is really rare. They don't always acknowledge that they've done some, that their device failed, especially if they don't have to, if they're not forced to do so. So yeah, they found it actually killed a bunch of people. And why was this an issue? Well, this is a typical case of lack of assessment being done. So even though, you know how I was talking about the US having this system where you can say, oh, this is very similar to the device before it, and it does minimal assessment, and then you can just put it on the market, the 510K pathway. So they used that to get this device to the market, which means they didn't have to do as much testing as you normally would have for a new device. So it said, this is just a newer model. We should be allowed to sell it straight away. We've done a little bit of testing, and off you go. So they went through that system. and they managed to get through. So this was one of the big reasons why the FDA then started reviewing that Me Too type of system. All right, so in 2012, they said, oh, this system has led to a lot of failures, and it has, to be fair. It had. We're approving unsafe and ineffective devices. They're using it as a loophole to get onto the market quicker, with only limited testing in the European Union. So they had failures with stent grafts, balloon catheters, aortic walls. There was a heart valve that failed, the self-opening valve that didn't last very long. So a lot of these devices had severe risks to patients, and they were a really high-risk class 3 device. And they caused blood clots, graft failure, and aneurysm ruptures. And then the FDA said, nah, we're going to fix this. And then there was a government change, and then the FDA said, well, we're going to actually strive to be first in the world for innovation. So forget that. Let's just get the newest stuff and stick it into people. And then came Trump, the orange man, who really likes to deregulate everything he can get his hands on. Some cases could be good, some cases could be bad, but when it comes to health, it's a bit dodgy. So he's actually signed off on a proposal to fast-track pre-market testing for some high-risk devices if they're innovative enough and if they're made in the US. So scary. So it actually means that you can shave years off of testing prior to product launch and save millions of dollars and gain access to the market a lot earlier. However, it means you're going to pay for it at the other end, right? And Shern, who is the FDA director, that was this May. Was it May in 2017 or 2018? He acknowledged that the proposal policy meant essentially accepting a bit more uncertainty. So for the fact that the FDA director said we're going to accept a bit more uncertainty because we were told to do that, tells you everything you need to know right there. So in 2017, under Trump, the FDA approved more than 3 times as many devices as it did in 2010, while its warnings to device manufacturers about product safety fell by nearly 80%. So that's statistics for you. Make of that what you will. But in a few more years, they're going to start to see the post-market issue with some of these devices. So it's too early to note it, but it will come. All right, and there's other issues with the US because, unlike Australia, some of the guidance around good clinical practice is not super clear. They do now have the sunshine provisions, but again, physicians and manufacturers are in some cases in business together. So the company will actually pass royalties on to the surgeon doing the testing, doing the clinical trials, or sometimes signing off on particular documents. So it's been criticized for that. They are required to disclose payments, and we know that they've paid up to $600 million to doctors within 1 year for various things, for studies and other things, and for personal stuff, which I think is horribly disgusting. But if they can afford to spend $600 million on just essentially marketing, imagine how much they're actually making. And they also spend a whole heap more than that on lobbying. So making sure that people lobby the government to increase deregulation, make it easier to sell and make money, be business friendly. There was one surgeon that was used as a case study. He earned nearly, so we didn't have time to do the metal-on-metal hip implants, but he earned $30 million in royalties from Johnson & Johnson for designing that metal-on-metal hip implant that failed. Right, and he still keeps earning that because of royalties associated with that product. Right. Yeah, so then they established this Sunshine Act, which sort of limits payments that you can give to physicians, but we know that there's ways around it. So Australia is really, really strict about this stuff, and I'm really glad. But again, having worked for a pharma company, I know that there's many different ways to skin a cat, and there's many different ways to promote something off indication, off label, without directly doing so. So that was my job. Okay. They also pay a lot of money in settlements because the US tends to be it's easier to sue in the US for damages than it is here, but then one of the conditions is that it's not disclosed to the public. So there might have been a lot more lawsuits that aren't disclosed that would have been settled out of court. And there's often confidentiality agreements associated with payouts. And these companies will not admit to having done anything wrong. And the reason I spend so much time on US-based companies is because we actually use it. So we import about 98% of medical devices that we use in Australia, and most of these are produced in Europe or US. And we have used some of these devices that were in question. Not all of them. We didn't use that new one, but some of them. So it's really important to know what environment they've been developed in and how they got the information that they have and how reliable it is. Okay, so whether a product is recalled may depend on where you live. So just because Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, Scotland, and England restricted the use of the surgical meshes associated with pelvic floor surgery doesn't mean that they've been withdrawn worldwide. So they're still used in Canada and South Africa. Actually, I think Canada just decided to stop using them, but South Africa is still using them. So third poor countries tend to get all the crap. All right. And as I said, some governments never even record issues, let alone do something about them. So I was talking about the metal hip, which released compounds into the circulation and surrounding muscle, which actually caused the muscle to atrophy. So it caused, it was nasty. It turns out it was done at the wrong angle, so it would get rubbed together, and after a while it would like release metal bits and pieces into the joint and then into the circulation. Flesh rotting metallosis, isn't that a fun word? So they don't use those anymore, but there's still people that have them. And you're like, well, do I remove them or do I leave them in? But you've got to do a risk-benefit assessment. Because as I said, joints wear out and they do only have a certain lifespan, and if you bring it by 5 years, and each time you do a revision on a joint implant, you have to cut away more and more bone to put the new implant in. So you get to a point where either the patient's too old or you just don't have enough to anchor your medical device. So by doing that revision surgery earlier, you might be taking away 10 years of mobility for that patient later on. So it's scary. All right, what was my other? Yep, and then again, officials can't find patients with the problem devices or even the doctors who implanted them. So there's no records being kept. In Australia, I think it's up, you have to keep medical records. It used to be 7 years, then it went up to 10, and now it's up to 30 years. But most of the time, they're paper records in some warehouse somewhere, because electronic patient records didn't come in until like 10 years ago. Even now, not all surgeries use them. I still see a specialist who's hardcore. He like handwrites stuff on like a little card. Terrifying. And I can't read his referrals, but I still go see him because he knows his stuff. So the big solution is, how are we doing for time? Oh my God, having patient registries. I think we might have to cover this at the next lecture, because what do you reckon? Cover it now or next time? Yeah? All right. So basically, patient registries are going to be the solution to a lot of this stuff, a way to capture this data and like stop this sort of stuff from happening. But how many slides do I have? I'm going to cover that next time because I want to spend some time on it, because I think that patient registries are a way of the future and they're really important. And because they're actually trying to, we have a national registry, which works really well, but they're trying to introduce global registries for well-used devices such as knees and joints and that sort of stuff. So we're going to do that next time. Thank you, guys. Okay, I will see you, some of you, in the workshop. Oh, what do you need to know for this lecture is, I'm not going to ask you to tell me the history of like medical device failure for a breast implant. I just want you to be aware of the fact that stuff can go wrong. Why does it go wrong? How do you recognize a failure? And I want you to think about what could possibly fail with the medical device that you guys are developing. What is, I know we talked about risk, but I want you to think about actual failure. in the real world if it was being used. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. And I will see you in the workshop.